welcome to the first episode of our brand new series, The cAMPfire. This is our new space for casual AMP conversations, like we used to have in between presentations and at our booths at really cool events like AMPconf. We miss answering all your questions about AMP, and now you can still ask us directly by leaving comments on this video or tweeting at us with the new hashtag AMPCAMPfire. My name is Crystal. I'm technically a writer working for the web on the AMP project, and your host for today's episode. Today, I have two AMP experts with me, Ben and Sebastian. So come gather around and introduce yourselves.
Hi, I'm Sebastian. I'm an engineer on the AMP Developer Relations team.
Hey, I'm Ben. I'm also on the AMP Developer Relations team and an advocate for the web in general. Hello.
Awesome. It's great to have two advocates here answering all of our awesome questions. So thank you both again. Let's kick this episode off by addressing a common misconception. Building interactive pages is hard in AMP. Sebastian, Ben, where do you think this comes from?
Maybe it came from how AMP originally was developed. So originally AMP was built for building really fast news articles. And news articles are not very interactive. So AMP was initially really aimed towards providing all the features that you would need on a news article. So we had carousels, sidebar, and things like that. But if you wanted to build, for example, an e-commerce landing page where you have a complex product configuration carousel thingy, then the features weren't there yet in AMP. But since then, many things have changed. So now AMP has become actually really powerful, and you can build really complex and interactive things.
So when AMP started, interactivity just wasn't really on the top of people's mind. But in order to keep things light and fast and lean and loading on people's devices quickly, interactivity started to grow in a different way than people are classically used to building with pages that allow any type of JavaScript. I guess that leads us directly into my second question, which is, how do I get started implementing interactivity into my AMP pages?
So with AMP, you do things a bit differently than when you're using typical websites. Usually when you're creating interactivity on the web, you use JavaScript to create interactions of various sorts. You might load in a third-party JavaScript library or write it yourself, but tends to involve adding JavaScript for everything. AMP, the philosophy is different. AMP is full of web components. Web components can be used to create pretty much most of the standard interactions that are possible on the web today. So for example, if you want to create an image carousel, also called an image slider sometimes, where you can swipe your fingers and move images around the screen, use a component called AMP carousel. To make an accordion where you can expand or contract content on your page, use AMP accordion. And these things are customizable not with JavaScript, but with attributes that change their functionality, and use CSS to style them however you want to.
So there's interactive components that meet these user interface things. Is there an option in AMP for me to show and hide elements? What about the more basic type things? Is there a component that is AMP-show?
Kind of. So the AMP runtime offers lots of built-in functionality. Exactly what you said. So you can hide things quite easily. So you just type my element ID .show to make it appear, or .hide to make it disappear again. You can also toggle CSS classes and things like that. So all these basic things are already built and are super easy to use.
Yeah, it's got this actions and event system that kind of resembles jQuery in some ways. So for example, let's say you've got a button you press over here. When this button is pressed, you want to hide something over here, like a menu or something else. So in the button, you would use the ID of the thing you want to hide. And like Sebastian said, you might attach to it an action called show or hide. So you say, my ID.show or my ID.hide, and then pressing the button shows or hides that thing. There's various other actions of this sort. And AMP also takes AMP takes browser events and processes those in various ways and feeds you events you can also use to do various actions. And components themselves can also create their own synthetic actions and events. So there's a lot of things you can do with actions and events.
Yeah, for example, AMP carousel has the action go to slide. And you can listen to slide change events. So for example, if in a carousel the slide changes, you can listen to the slide change event, and then, for example, update the preview in a in the thumbnail view of the carousel.
So it's different. Once you get used to using it, it tends to be easier. You're not writing code for everything, and that makes it also more maintainable. It's harder to create bugs of that sort that you just can't really figure out what to do with, or have bugs from dependencies from other JavaScript libraries.
Yeah, not writing code is fantastic.
Also, if you're not a person who knows JavaScript that well, that can be simpler too. You can actually be a designer who can't really code yet and make an interactive page using HTML.
Yeah, that's actually really...
It can be quite empowering.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I recently spoke to a developer, and he said that basically one of their design interns was able, without any programming background, was able to build a full website for their client using AMP because programming was not available, not needed to build it. And I think that's such a fantastic example for how useful AMP can be.
The web is complicated and it can be hard, but it shouldn't be that hard, really. And AMP really wants to make it easier to make a nice interactive page.
And using AMP is a little bit like using the built-in HTML elements. So it's just use a normal website, use buttons and select or whatever, and then you also use the AMP carousel, and it's all declarative HTML, which is super easy to write.
So it sounds like getting started with AMP is learning what UI components are available to me and understanding just how the AMP way is to implement these actions and events like show and hide, and the actions and events that each component makes available for me, because we kind of understand what users are looking for when they interact with things and have made a lot of that available. So getting started is super easy if you're looking for these things to just grab and go and throw it in. And it just takes it from a lens, instead of building it from the ground up, you're instead just using these things that are already available instead of redefining all of it. It's awesome that we have all of these things that are available, all of these components that meet really cool UI cases. But what if there isn't a component that meets my interactivity needs? What do I do then?
You can do various things by putting components together, first of all. So there's now a component that's, is it called AMP Mega Menu, that makes complicated menus? I haven't used it yet, to be honest. But before this existed, let's say you wanted to make a menu that had bits that you could expand and contract. You could use AMP Accordion for those little bits, and use AMP Sidebar for the whole menu. So combining together AMP Accordion and AMP Sidebar made it possible to do a whole other kind of interaction that didn't exist before. So the most basic thing is composing components together.
Well, what if I want two components to interact with each other that I can't combine together?
So yeah, that's what AmpBind is for. So so AmpBind is a component that allows you to bind state or data, or you can think of it as a one big JSON object if you want so, and bind this to your UI. For example, one component, so for example, if you have a button, you click on it, and this modifies your state. For example, you increase a counter. Then another element on your page will display the current value of the counter. So and all this happens via AmpBind. So the button calls the update state, and the counter view binds the value that's displayed to the value the counter variable. And this is basically all there is to AmpBind, but by using this, you can build quite complex experiences in AMP.
So it sounds like AmpBind is starting to come in when I need to start like processing and manipulating data instead of just like regular interactions, like showing and hiding or jumping to pages or opening and closing. AmpBind is really when I need to start calculating things.
It's useful actually in both cases. You can also use AmpBind to have just components communicate between each other. So for example, if you have, let's say you had two image carousels, one with small thumbnails, one with big images, you could then use these things, have a state variable that contains the index of the slide that you're on. And when you click on the carousel over here, it can then tell the other carousel where to go. And also, as you're saying exactly, it can be used for calculations of various sorts. And these can also affect state variables, which can then affect the DOM, or even affect things like you can change server calls, for example. You can change the query parameters in a server call, and then that will then trigger a server call and pull in new data. So it's quite powerful.
It sounds like AMP bind is kind of where I need to start heading when things are getting complex, and when I really start wanting to build out my UI and doing things like uh, connecting things and interactions. And does AMP bind have a limit? Like, what if I wanted to do something really interesting, like a to-do list? Is that something I can tell AMP bind to just start setting all my to-dos, leave my page, come back later? Is AMP bind the solution for that?
So AMP-bind, it's, as the name says, it's really for binding state to UI, but it's not really made for managing complex state as a to-do list, which, I mean, these can get crazy complex. I'll just need to look at my own to-do list. But if you try to do this, you will notice that there's a certain limitations. For example, AMP-bind, it's mostly it's built up, you write a single expression, for example, when a certain action is triggered, and writing nested if statements in a single expression quickly gets quite unhandy. So if you find yourself nesting if expressions, that is a good indicator for that maybe AMP-bind is not the right thing to do here. Another one of my favorite warning signals when using AMP-bind is when I have when I find myself looking up the documentation for reduce. This operation, I just never really remember how to actually use it. So that's also for me a good indicator. Okay, now maybe I'm trying to do something that's too complex for AMP-bind.
Okay, so AMP bind has a lot of capabilities, but at a certain point, things might be getting too complex, which is great because my next question is, what do I do if my use case is too complex for AMP bind?
The nice thing is you can go beyond AMP-bind with this component called AMP-script. It lets you do what you want to do all along, probably add JavaScript to your pages. But AMP-script is cool because you can use JavaScript, but in a way that will not impact your page's performance, because AMP-script runs your JavaScript in a web worker. And there's this pretty cool thing called worker DOM that lets you communicate between the worker and the main page, because web workers, as you may know, cannot access the DOM. So what this does is it emulates the most useful parts of the DOM API and lets you use those things in a naturalistic way. So let's say you've got some complex business logic you want to use in your page somewhere, it might take 30, 40 lines of JavaScript. You can write AMP-script for that, and it can go ahead and send stuff back to the page, and it's easier. I mean, I've seen many cases where people have written e-commerce pages using AMP-bind and the other AMP components, and you can do it. But as Sebastian was saying before, after a certain point, it can get sort of hairy. AMP-script makes it, if you will, less hairy, more smooth.
So I'm gonna need some clarification here. So AMP start off as simplicity, like simple ways to do things without JavaScript. And it turns out people really want to use AMP and really want to do complex things. So now we've given them a way to write their own JavaScript with AMP script. Why would I ever not use AMP script if I can just throw in all the JavaScript I'm used to writing?
Well, first of all, AMP-bind does involve JavaScript expressions. So it's a simpler bit of JavaScript. But really, I think that for most applications, AMP-bind is just easier. If you want to just show something, hide something, do a little simple logic and change something on the page, have components communicate between different components, AMP-bind is great for all those things. It's just like Sebastian was saying before, if you're managing complex state variables or having 8 or 9 interactions at a certain point, it gets hard to figure out what you're doing after a while. And then JavaScript lets you be a good programmer in those cases and make it just actually simpler in those cases.
So there's a lot of discussion about complexity thresholds. And I'm finding this very interesting. Like once you hit the complexity threshold with AMP bind, you move on to AMP script. But we've also been talking a lot about combining components. So is there a certain point where I move completely off of AMP bind into AMP script, or is there a point where I can start using these components together?
So, I mean, there's one key difference. So AMP-bind, you can use it across all elements on your page. Whereas AMP-script, is only focused on the elements inside the AMP script component. So it's really meant for building your own components using JavaScript. And you can combine these really nicely. For example, you can build a, let's call it a logic component using AMP script, which basically handles all your complex business logic. And you use AMP bind to tie this component through the rest of the page. So you trigger a calculation in your AMP script, and then you update the state on the page again, which will then trigger changes in your bindings and will update all the different elements on your page. So in that sense, these two work really well together. But the important thing here is each should do what they're really good at. AMP bind to bind data to your eye across the page, and AMP script to implement more complex things.
Yeah, for most interactions in the page, AMP bind will be totally sufficient. In certain cases, like Sebastian's saying, you want to create your own little virtual component using AMP script. And you can use the state variables to communicate between the two, because AMP script can get and set state variables. So once again, data binding can be used, as you were saying, Crystal, to combine components and use their powers together. Kind of like the Avengers. All their powers work well together. Like my hands here, see, working well together.
So AMP is the ultimate superhero team, and we've covered so much ground about interactivity in AMP and like the way it can build up. And I hate to ask this question, but what if I'm trying to do something that is too complex for AMP script? What then?
It totally happens because AMP script is a subset of the DOM API. It doesn't do everything, and you can do amazing things in AMP script, like you can even use Preact, for example, and use modern frameworks. But at a certain point, it's going to be limiting too. And maybe in those cases, if you're writing like a video player or a mail program or a photo editing app, AMP is not the right choice in those cases. You should just use JavaScript in the way you always use it. However, in those cases, it can still be a problem to make the page performant. If you have a lot of JavaScript, a lot of things that are happening, if you have frameworks that take up a lot of time to do anything, it's going to degrade the user experience. So the good thing is you can now use bento AMP, which means you can use AMP components outside of the context of AMP. You can just put those components on any page on the web, and they'll do their magic. They're compact, they're quick, they're designed to be stable and maintain AMP's performance guarantees, at least in terms of those interactions. So yeah, you could then use AMP components when you need basic interactions. And for those special cases where you can't use AMP components or AMP script, you could use your own JavaScript.
Thanks, guys. That was a really awesome discussion. And this is our last chance in this episode to really dive into interactivity. And I would like to take this opportunity to share some key takeaways for our audience. So, leaving the campfire, what do I need to know about interactivity and AMP?
So, the most important thing is just to realize that AMP works a little bit different. And basically, the first, when you start building something with AMP, you have to familiarize yourself with how AMP works. So this means what are the basic actions events that are available, which components are available, and how can you combine components and things like that. Because just doing these basic things, you can already create really great interactive user experiences. And then once you've done that, then you can start thinking about, okay, how can I build more complex things in AMP using AMP bind or AMP script? But I wouldn't give up and start just using AMP script straight away. But it's really important to first start with the things that are already built in AMP, and which are actually the things that make AMP really great and easy to use.
I totally agree with that. And I also want to add that in the past, using AMP meant buying into AMP's validation rules, which of course are there to help guarantee a good user experience. You want to be in the AMP cache, so there were certain restrictions you had to abide by, which made your page more guaranteed to be fast and stable. but some use cases were harder than others. With Bento AMP, that no longer is true, because with Bento AMP, you can just start using AMP components on any page you want to. You can begin removing things that are heavier or harder to maintain, and you can just try AMP out on the page you have right now. And as you like AMP, if you're enjoying the experience of using AMP, as making things better for your users, and the dollars or euros or yen or rupees are rolling in, as they may, just keep on going.
Sebastian, Ben, I can't thank the two of you enough for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
Oh, thanks. Was great to be here.
We covered so much ground about interactivity in AMP, and I learned so much. But before I release y'all back into the webby woods, I'd like to announce our topic for the next episode. And it was alluded a little bit in this one, and that is Bento. That's right. We're going to be talking about the ability to take AMP components and use them anywhere on the web. And we're going to be diving much deeper into what that means for AMP and the future and all of that really cool stuff. So I'd like to encourage anybody watching and anybody interested to tweet at us your questions about Bento at the hashtag #AmpCampfire, or you can drop those questions in the comments below, or join us on Slack. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see y'all soon.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.